I saw like one of the projects you worked on GitHub, like Sweaterify.
Yep.
I think I'm pronouncing that right. And it kind of amazed me that looking at code from a sort of artistry point of view, like code as an art form or as a medium, and what you think about that.
Yeah, so like the Sweaterify was basically browser-based way to experiment and test a knitting pattern, and then like kind of visualize it in front of you before you actually spend time on knitting stuff. The way I came across was that when I was making knitting pattern, knitting come in two forms. It's like a graph paper, pretty much visualize, the blueprint of what it's look like, or it comes in like form of written instruction. So it's, cast on this much stitches and then knit this pattern. It's like in like a written language. And then what I noticed was that it is really close to code. It was very much knitting code. So I was like, oh, I can just put that into my JavaScript. I was a JavaScript developer back then, so I can do it in JavaScript, and that's how it kind of got started. But then I realized that I can quickly iterate my creative process because it is in code, and it's like all the variables are all in the place. I can tweak the variables. I can see what it's like in 100 different versions, and I find it really interesting. Then I discovered like a creative coding community that does like a generative art. So it's the art is the output, but then they write code and they kind of like experiment with different algorithms and tweak the variables and then like see what happens. It's like really different approach from software engineering.
Yeah.
Like in software engineering, I worked as a software engineer. It's just like you don't really want unexpected results. There's a target that you need to hit. It's all defined, and then you write a code for it. But then when you think about the coding as a creative process, you kind of start to introduce like a fun to like, oh, what if I change that to -1?
And the fear of the unknown, right? You're embracing that. I know I want to create something interesting, but I have no idea what that is. And then you just let the sort of the pieces fall where they're meant.
Yep.
I mean, how do you go about sketching that stuff? Because I mean, from when a designer's like, I mean, I can't design in browser. I don't understand how anyone can. Not necessarily literally sketching, could be anything like writing code comments or whatever. But I mean, how do you? Because that's the bit which if I find so difficult to understand is. I look at the code and it's like looking at the matrix, and I don't understand how you get from. It's almost like write code ? Profit. Do you know what I mean? So it's like how do you actually get to? What's the process of actually designing the thing?
Designing the thing. So I feel like there's like iteration, like anything. There is like iteration of stuff. But I start with paper actually. So I have an idea. If it was I was creating like some kind of art, a visual or something, I would go for like I want to have this circle on this page, or like kind of like a visual set. I pretty much like comes from like a visual mindset. So I can't start from logic. I just start from like here's the thing I want to see on the screen. Granted, it will not end up like that at all at the end. But then I get to code after I have like some basic ideas of how my visual wants to look like, and then there's like another design iteration of negotiation between whatever technology that I'm using, usually browsers and JavaScript and Web API, that like I thought I wanted to make this interaction on paper, but it doesn't really work on browser because I changed the medium, and that's my medium. And negotiation between technology and my creativity of like, how can I achieve what I wanted to do in my head on this medium that is usually web browser for me. And sometimes it's impossible, or sometimes it's not reasonable to do the interaction that I thought I want to make on my head or paper. And I'm like, all right. And then sometimes I discover like a new API or like a new thing in browser, and being able to like, oh, actually I can change that. This is quite interesting. I can change my original design to do something different. So it's usually ended up like a completely different thing from what I originally sketched. But I quite enjoy the discussion and negotiation between technology and me.
Yeah.
Kind of like a game of like, I have this plan. Can I do this in browser? And will browser let me do this? If not, can I find a loophole? Is there like, kind of clearing up the level?
And playing a game basically with the technology and trying to discover what is possible and what isn't. But also you can often, take lessons learned from that art
Yeah.
into your every. I mean, it may not be like you're doing some generative pattern, but there's like a technique or coding thing that you can bring back in, which is like, invaluable, right?
Totally. I learned so many things that I code snippets that I ended up using in my production code for my job. It's,
So do you recommend knitting as a way to learn how to do?
I do. It's quite algorithmic process. I recommend anybody to do it. It's quite binary. Knitting, I'm going into super geeky stuff.
Yeah.
But in knitting, there's two versions of stitches, which is like yarn, pulling the yarn from the back or pushing the yarn from front. And that creates like a different face of a knitwear. And the combination of that creates complicated patterns. So it's basically binary. And how you arrange that binary and how you repeat that binary pattern becomes the final product. So it's when you're designing the knitting pattern, it's quite like exercise of defining the algorithm to get to this pattern.
For a designer to get to learn how to sort of see code as like paint or whatever, or see a developer sort of just embracing the unpredictable, I mean, what advice would you give to them?
So I think every time I do creative projects, the question I get or the feedback I get is like, so what? Or what does it do? How is it useful, right? And getting over those mentality of if you do code, you have to make useful tools that everybody's going to use and get so many GitHub stars and you get VC funding and start a startup.
Yeah.
I'm like, you don't need to aim for that. You can just use coding as a creative expression to, flex the creative muscles. And once you thinking about what I'm making, it doesn't have to make money, it doesn't have to make sense, it doesn't have to help somebody else. This is purely for my fun and discovery, then it gets a lot easier to experiment. It gets a lot easier to, get into code and just make 100 different versions that is not tracked on GitHub. And that's totally fine.
Providing a performing experience is something that requires, close collaboration between two sides. I don't think I'd ever seen skeleton screens as a concept until I started reading blogs that designers were working on.
Yeah.